Hello, everybody. Welcome wherever you are in the world. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I always feel like I'm on the Truman Show when when I say that. But a very warm welcome to all of you. Just to preempt any questions that you may have, we will be making a recording of this webinar available to you. However, we will not, I'm afraid, be able to share the slides. We will have you with us for approximately 45 minutes today. So as usual, we like to put faces to names. I'm Rob on the right there, and together with my colleague Joel, based in Singapore, we will be hosting this webinar today. But on the left, Orlando is, of course, the star of the show. We're always delighted to welcome our guest speakers, but especially happy to introduce you, or maybe reintroduce you to Orlando, one of the most inspiring people genuinely that I've come across in our
Thank you, Rob.
industry.
And hello, good
You're
morning.
welcome. And for those of you who happen to visit System One's offices in London, look out for his amazing artwork on the walls. I was slightly irritated that he just happened to pick that skill up and as a hobby. It's a lovely guy, but one of us might call him an overachiever. No, really nice to have you, Orlando, with us today.
Pleasure to be here.
But before we get to Orlando, I just wanted to remind you, as with all our webinars, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A widget at the bottom there. And we're going to allow some time for Orlando to respond to those at the end of the webinar today. Now, for those of you who are less aware of the WFA, you may not know that actually we're proud to have 60 national advertiser associations in membership. And looking at the excellent attendance today, I notice Lindsay from ANZA in New Zealand. Welcome, Lindsay. And I'm sure there's many others along with some of their members as well. So a very warm welcome to all of you. And we also now have approximately 120 multinational companies in membership. So you see the brand owners here, so client-side marketers only. And as a not-for-profit membership organization, our agenda is driven by your priorities, of course. And no prizes for getting, of course, what's top of everyone's agendas right now. And the COVID-19 pandemic has obviously impacted all of our lives to varying degrees. And if you hear my children shouting in the background at any point in this webinar, I'm sure many of you will empathize now more than you ever would. But seriously, our guest speaker has written on this about COVID-19 recently and explains how his research that we're going to hear about today is perhaps more relevant in the current crisis than ever. And given the many sort of acts of spontaneity, altruism, and even humor that COVID-19 has engendered, this may in fact be the thing that triggers a real mental reset and a cultural shift. So we will be focusing on that. But before I give too much away, I wanted to briefly share some findings from our own work. A very recent member study closed yesterday, in fact, on our members' actions related to the crisis. So we asked our members what action they're taking, and the good news is that nearly 80% have been quick to provide guidance for their colleagues and also for their agency partners. But the bad news for the industry overall, I guess, is that over 80% have also felt that they'd had to defer their campaigns. So that's the largest share by a month or two, but another 28% saying by a quarter. So whilst over half saying their marketing budgets have decreased, interestingly, almost 80% have actually said they have created or plan to create new campaigns in response to the current situation. Most of those have been we've been hearing about have been sort of empathetic messages, or have tried to be useful in terms of promoting certain messages, for example, stay at home. I think it was quite interesting. 56% said that they'd created a bespoke communication via email for their customers. Now, I don't know about you, but this sort of feels a bit like a GDPR moment as a consumer, that I seem to receive an email from every brand I did or didn't know I shared my email with at the moment, telling me that they're by my side right now. So obviously mixed messages being included there. But As you know, we want to keep these sessions interactive. So I'm going to ask Joel now to throw up a poll, a question for you. So one of our members recently commented in the study I mentioned, your brand and its purpose may not be a priority for your customers right now. It's quite an interesting perspective. So my question to you, and obviously relevant to the folks today, is do you feel brands are oversharing? Okay, interesting. I suppose that's not a huge surprise, but yeah, nearly 20% saying there's overshare, 71% saying maybe, but you need to get the tone and the messaging right, and only 11% saying now is not the time to go quiet. So, Orlando, in a minute, I'm going to ask you to perhaps comment on that. But keep those responses in mind. Thank you for your input, everybody. So. In terms of the messages that are being put out right now, we've really seen some pretty creative and innovative responses from brand owners really trying to make a difference. And we've pulled together something we've called our COVID Compendium. This is an open source tool. So normally we tend to keep our value, if you like, within the membership, but this is open to all. Please encourage you, see the URL on the top left there, go and take a look. We're going to be talking in terms of the sort of 4 Ps of marketing, which we've conveniently turned into the 6 Ps for this. We're going to be focusing on promotion today, but obviously that's only one of the levers available to you. But I do encourage you to share your stories with us. I've just included a sample here. So AB InBev in China, LVMH in France, Lush in the UK, and our friends at Coca-Cola in the Philippines, just some examples. But the idea is that these are designed as inspiration for you, which can come from any market, of course, and any brand. So please feel free to enjoy it and spread the word if you can, or even come to us with your own stories if you feel we've missed anything. So now, I'm sure you've heard many people saying that actually the world may never be the same again. And our guest speaker today, Orlando, will tell you that actually history has been littered with some big cultural shifts, which has actually happened during periods of hardship. So you may be right if that's what you've been thinking as well. But there's a reason why Orlando is here with you today. As you can see from his book, his brain is far bigger than mine. Sorry, Orlando, that's a terrible introduction, but I'm sure you've heard that gag about 20 times. But Orlando has created this book, Lemon, in concert with the IPA, which is the very well-regarded agency association in the UK. So enough from me. Remains for me to say a very warm welcome back to the WFA, Orlando, and I'll hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Rob. That's very kind of you, and thanks for having me. So I'm going to talk you through, I suppose my book, Lemon, because Lemon is really all about the kind of creative that connects well with people, and it's become actually even more pertinent in this period of COVID-19. When we're asking ourselves, what do we need to say? How should we say it? What's the best way to connect with people? And Lemon takes as its starting point the work of Peter Field, who published with the IPA again in May of last year, The Crisis in Creative Effectiveness. And in this piece of work, Peter traces the decline in creative effectiveness over the last 15 years or so. And my book, Lemon, provides both a diagnosis and a cure as to what we should do about it. And it also offers a kind of warning as to what happens to the world when one mode of attending to it becomes too dominant in individuals, in society, and in business. We've seen tremendous changes in business and the way that we operate and interact with each other over the last 20 years. Some incredible technological changes, of course, but we've also seen urges towards standardization, centralization, and specialization in this period, all of which leave inevitable traces in culture, as much today as they did in the late Roman Empire. Now, go with me on this, and I appreciate it's not an obvious place to start. The late Roman Empire was a tumultuous time for Rome, the 3rd century AD. It was being attacked on all sides, and the emperors of the time came and went with remarkable regularity and frequency until Emperor Diocletian assumed power. And Emperor Diocletian set about regimenting society, and he categorized people into their roles. He fixed prices across the whole of Europe in perhaps what was the first ever rate card. And this meant that people started to go out of business, and in fact could not continue their businesses. To counter this, he introduced measures which meant that your children had to follow in the footsteps, of your profession. And he introduced, therefore, a kind of specialization, a specialism across professions everywhere. So this sort of centralization and standardization and specialization had an enormous effect on culture. And I'm going to show you some examples of this now. And I'd like to start by showing you this bust of Decius on the left here. And this was from the period immediately before Diocletian. And I'd like you to look at a few things. Look at the furrows on this man's brow. Look at the scar on his cheek. Look at the stubble on his chin. And look at the folds in his tunic. Look at the way he looks up. Looking up at something's caught his attention, he's caught in a moment. What's going through his mind? It's difficult to tell. In fact, it poses more questions than it seeks to answer. But within this period of standardization and specialization, within a few generations of Diocletian's reforms, busts start to look like this. Less expression, flatter in a sense, more symmetrical, more like a death mask than an evocation of the living. And it's not just busts that changed either. Architectural friezes changed. So this is from the period before, and you've got free and flowing tendrils, a sense of depth. It's not perfectly symmetrical. And you move towards this, flatter, more symmetry, an emphasis on signs and symbols. We move from mosaics that depict people together, connecting, a sense of betweenness, a sense of depth and a sense of contrast with light and shade and even movement, towards this, an image of Christ that's flat, it's devitalized, that is sort of me at you, unilateral communication, and signs and symbols around his head. We move from natural compositions of people in organic groups, touching each other, connecting with each other, a sense of betweenness again, glancing up and looking around, towards a depiction of people, in this case the saints, that's very flat, that relies on repeated rhythms, that is where there is no sense of betweenness, and this sort of devitalized face that's replicated across the piece. Signs and symbols, the wreaths and the palms and the letters, of course, appear. But surely I'm not suggesting that this is happening today, am I? Well, I am suggesting it's happening today. It's happening in culture all around us, and it's certainly happening in advertising. A kind of flatness, a devitalization, a dislocation from time and place. It's not obvious where things are set and where we are when we see it. And this sort of rectilinearity and repetition that is so common today. So why might this be happening? Well, I take as my starting point the work of a brilliant scientist called Ian McGilchrist, who's written a book called The Master and His Emissary. And Ian McGilchrist explains how the brain attends to the world. Since the 1960s, we've thought that perhaps the left and the right brain might do different things. This pop psychology narrative has become very well known. that the left brain might do, I don't know, analysis, and the right brain might be more emotional. Now, this isn't true, and it's been debunked. But what's emerging in its place is a more sophisticated and nuanced understanding of the two hemispheres and how they attend to the world. And it's not that they do different things, as we used to think. It's that they do things differently. They have different takes on the world, different priorities, if you like. And the clue as to how they look at the world is perhaps to be found in their structure. So the left brain has prioritizes really information within localized brain region, whereas the right brain has much greater branching, more overlap, if you like, and is more associative in its structure. Not only that, but it has more white matter than grey relative to the left brain. And this white matter, called myelin, helps it to conduct faster. So it's more associative and quicker as well. It's also bigger than the left brain. The brain is asymmetrical. So these give some clues as to what the brain sort of does and how it operates, if you like. And the left brain in people, in mammals, and in birds has a different sort of attentional focus from the right. Let's take birds for a minute because it's instructive and helps to set out a few principles. So in birds, the left brain, which controls the right-hand side of the body and the right eye, it is responsible for narrow and goal-orientated attention. And so when you see a bird pecking around on the ground for grains, it's the left brain really dominated with a very narrow and dominant sort of style. And it's abstracting those grains from their context, it's categorizing them, and it's identifying them. Now, the right brain, all the while, which is controlling the left-hand side of the body and the left eye, is broad and vigilant in its attention. It's on the lookout. It's alert for threats. It's open to novelty. And it is broader in its focus. And so these are the starting point for some important principles about how the two halves of the brain see the world. So the left brain is narrow in its attention, goal-orientated, abstracts things from their context and likes to break things down into smaller parts. It likes to categorize things, and it likes things to be explicit, so it can't really deal with ambiguity or nuance. Things are sort of black and white, truths or lies. It believes in linear cause and effect. It likes to think, it likes things that are familiar, and it likes things to be repeatable, replicable. It is quite literal, quite factual in the way that it sees things. So no room for nuance. And you see in patients who've got right brain damage and therefore who are left brain dominant, they're sort of self-absorbed and they're dogmatic, and they often have an unfounded sense of optimism. These are things that go with the left brain. And it likes things and tools, and its principal tool is language. Language, signs, and symbols are things really of the left brain, and tools with which to manipulate the world. It can't really understand music, and its desire for replication means that it can only really understand very basic rhythm. So this other center of consciousness, the complementary and conflicting sort of center of consciousness, is the right brain, with its broad and vigilant attention. Of the 5 types of attention that psychologists broadly agree on, the 4 of them are dealt with principally by the right hemisphere. It's broad and vigilant in its attention. It's responsible for sustained attention too. And it understands the world as it really is. It sees the whole. It understands things in their context. It, unlike the left brain, which is really interested in things, it understands people. It is responsible for empathy. It understands tone, expression, accents, gestures, things that wrap around the words, if you like, the implicit. In fact, it sees the whole world as a set of connections and relationships, and it is open to novelty, and it's open to contradiction. So it can well believe that 2 conflicting ideas could both be true at the same time. And that means it understands both metaphor and humor and appreciates it. And it's very self-aware of its time and place in the world and very questioning of it. It's a bit of a devil's advocate. And it's what gives us our sense of lived time, space, and depth. And it's also what gives us our appreciation of music, because it understands, it has that sort of depth that comes with texture, timbre, harmony. Those things and its sense of lived time help it to understand and appreciate music. So if we were to ask anyone really to draw a flower, here are some participants, and we disabled their left brain, so it was only the right brain drawing the flower, and this is possible through electroconvulsive seizure for just half an hour or so, and we got the right brain to draw a flower, you get flowers that look a bit like these on the right here, which are full flower heads, a complete stem and leaves, and a sense of 3 dimensions, the flower head tilted on its side in a couple of instances. Now, if you ask the left brain to do exactly the same thing, and these rows here are the same people, then you get a very different kind of flower, a wizened representation of a flower, just the most important bit, if you like, the flower head that's flattened. It's a sort of a model or a symbol of what a flower is, and could be used to denote a flower very quickly and easily. But it doesn't see things as they really are. It sort of strips them back to a flatter way of looking at them. And so what we really need, of course, is the whole brain for great creative leaps. The right brain sees the world as it really is and sees the whole. The left brain then represents it back to us and helps us to interact with it, manipulate the world with what we see, the models that it creates, and then that sort of is reintegrated back into the right brain through dreaming and a gradual process. So that's how the 2 halves of the brain operate. And if you wanted to see how the world was seen by the left brain, it would look a bit like this. Flattened and abstracted, cube, table, tree. It's terrible with people. It can't really understand or see them or relate to them terribly well. This sort of flattening and abstraction and devitalization, which is actually a precursor to modern art, more of that a bit later, is something that you see with the left brain. So you've got these 2 halves of the brain, and they're connected in the middle by the corpus callosum, which is a bundle of fibers stripped back here in the diagram. And this bundle of fibers bridges the 2 brains, but actually its main purpose, it turns out, is to inhibit one brain or another at any given time. And the left brain has a greater suppressive effect on the right than the right does on the left. And so at certain times in history, what you tend to find in individuals and groups and society as a whole is you get this sort of left brain drift towards a way of seeing the world that is very narrow, it's very goal-orientated, that is quite abstracted, that deals in truths or lies. Things are either facts or not. It deals in sort of linear cause and effect. It can't deal with nuance or ambiguity. It is pretty dogmatic, quite angry too, because anger lateralizes to the left hemisphere. And society becomes increasingly sort of rhythmic and governed by signs and symbols. So this sort of drift happened in the late Roman period, and it's been happening over the last 20 years or so in our society too. And so what I'd like to do now is to take you through several periods in history and the art associated with that history, and show you how to kind of read this in art, because this is going to be very helpful when it comes to reading this in advertising and has implications for its effectiveness. So let's pick up our story 1,000 years on from the Romans and look at this medieval manuscript. That period of flatness lasted 1,000 years or so, and you can still see that it here and this sort of strange distorted perspective. But it also betrays something else of the left hemisphere, and that's that it deals in power and control. And so the big people here aren't closer to us and the little people further away, but actually they represent something else. They represent the control and power of these people. It's very much like an organogram of today. But then something remarkable happened in about 1420, 1425, and that is, of course, the Renaissance in Florence. After a long period of plagues, actually, reminiscent of today, what you tend to find is that depth starts to appear in art. And you get these different planes of depth. Depth and empathy actually go very closely together. And you get this flow of characters in the background, this sort of sense of movement. You also get a referencing of other times in the architecture that's shown here, referencing antiquity. You also get on the right-hand side here shepherds that are referencing a painting 10 years before. And in a knowing reference, you'll see the man here pointing at Christ in the foreground. He is the artist himself. So there's depth, there's empathy, there's movement, there's referencing of other things. There's a sense that we're caught in a moment. There is a general kind of connection here between the characters. Now, that Renaissance sort of moved north, and then in time we get the Reformation. And the Reformation shares many of the characteristics of today's world, in that it was all about stripping things back to the authentic. It was about removing metaphor, removing ornament, removing characters in the form of the saints. And so what you get in churches in this time is people not standing freely looking at the altar, but instead regimented in pews looking at the pulpit from where the word of God is proclaimed. And the word takes on new importance in this period. And so if you look at art in the period, what you find is it looks a bit like this on the left. Of course, you've got the big people and the little people again. You've got lots of abstracted little scenes and no sort of coherent sense of the whole. But you've got words everywhere telling you what to think or do. And it's as if the images behind only serve to reference those words. So after the Reformation, we get a period again, actually, of a number of plagues that happen in the late 17th century, early 18th century. And you get the Baroque era, and in the Baroque era, there is a heightened sense of empathy, a sense of sensuality, and you get art such as this with its depth. Caught in a moment, we're caught in a moment in time, the clouds passing over the canal, and in music, you get Bach's passions, you get mixed emotions, you get contrasts, high, fast and slow, high and low. And in architecture in Europe, you get the great palaces of Europe collaborating, architects and artists that provide a sense of awe. Awe is a very right-brained response and shows a connection with the moment and with place. And then you get the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, again, is a bit like today's world, where things are seen in black and white terms. And it was felt that no question could go unanswered in this period. And you see manufacturing, replication start to take hold in society, in the new factories of the time, people moving to towns and cities. And in this period, you get you get the French Revolution, and this is from the French Revolution, and it shows many of the features of the left brain, this painting. So first of all, you've got all sorts of people just dotted around with the chickens, as if they were things, not really doing very much. You've got the abstraction in the architecture behind, bits of building, are all emblazoned with words, and you've got words appearing everywhere. So and symbols of the revolution. So the Tree of Liberty, the hats, the pickaxes, and so on of the revolutionaries, the flag, and the all-seeing eye of truth, tellingly above. Now, in schizophrenic patients who have psychotic episodes, if you ask them what they're drawing, often they will draw a single eye watching over them, because the left brain is rather paranoid. It likes to control things, and it relies on the right brain to pass it information. And when the right brain isn't working properly, you end up with this sort of sense of paranoia across society, actually. And I've certainly heard the eyes of history are upon us quite a lot over recent years. But then we get a very different movement, a very whole brain movement called the Romantic period. And in the Romantic period, you get many things that are going to be increasingly important today in this period of the virus. And that's a sense of betweenness and connection between people. Look here at the two women in the foreground, one with her arm around the other, looking out at the men, looking out at the boats. If the left brain does desire and wanting, the right brain does longing and yearning. And you'll also notice that there's a firm connection with place. Place became very important in the Romantic period. And also the ambiguity, the visual ambiguity, the indistinct becomes important in this period. So lots of art and music about nighttime dreams. Dreams are a thing of the right brain too. So these are the sorts of things that are going to be, I assert, very important in this period we're in today. But then there was increasing mechanization, and we get into the 20th century, and art becomes, and culture, high culture, becomes very abstracted, self-conscious. There's a flattening that occurs. This table looks like the pictures I was showing you earlier. And you get, even in music, you know, Schoenberg saying how the music sounds is hardly the point. It becomes very difficult to appreciate intuitively. But the right brain found a way through in popular culture in the 60s, in a new wave of film, fashion, and of course music and commercial television with advertising. And for a period of about 45 years, we had some really whole-brained advertising. And I want to show you an ad from the middle of that period from the UK. And I'd like you to look out for some of the right-brained features I've been talking about. So there'll be a very clear sense of place. It will be a scene unfolding. You will notice that the characters are speaking in different accents. The whole thing relies on accents. The language and the words used are really only there to be played with, not as a sort of communication tool. You'll notice the whole thing is a metaphor, and also it's referencing something else, a famous film and a book. So let's have a watch of this ad.
The water in Mallorca doesn't taste like what it ought to.
No. The water in Mallorca don't taste like what it ought to.
The water in Mallorca doesn't taste quite how it should.
Mallorca.
Mallorca?
Mallorca.
Mallorca?
Hi, Dale, any danger of some refreshment in here?
Here you are. Get your laughing gear in there.
Oh, golly. The water in Mallorca,
What's that?
don't taste like what it oughta. Oh, gosh. The water in Mallorca don't taste like what it oughta.
She's cracked it. She's only cracked it.
You're absolutely wrong.
Heineken refreshes the parts what other beers cannot reach.
Accent's very important there. Now let's have a look at an ad from 2018. I'd like you to look out for the left brain features I've been talking about. You'll notice that the people are devitalized and shown as sort of tools or things. You'll notice a sense of abstraction in all the things that are shown. You'll notice the words emblazoned on everything, telling you what to think, what to do. You'll also notice that it's very rhythmic. You'll notice it's quite self-conscious as well. Lots of different scenes, no sense of lived time or place. And you'll notice how unilateral the communication is, me at you. So here we go.
Look, everybody wanna go and talk it. At the same time, gotta walk it. Better yet, run, go, hit a lick, divvy up with my homies and we do it all again. They just wanna find a way out, find a way to put a little food up in their mouth. I could get a verse and then go about my business. You ain't even see it coming, can I get a witness? When I go to sleep, I only dream about my other dreams. Perception. If you want it, gotta get it, gotta live it, no condition.
quite different in feeling. And actually, if you look at other ads too, you'll notice the sort of sense of abstraction, bits of people, lips, hands, flatness, no sense of time or place. You'll also notice symbols emerging on the left here. And on the right, ads from 20, 30 years ago, you'll notice a sense of time and place, often in the past. You'll notice the sense of connection and betweenness in the characters, and the sense of a scene unfolding, depth and betweenness. So is this just in my mind? Well, I set out to work out, to do a sort of objective study of this, and I set out to understand, what kind of features might be visible in advertising if it had gone a bit left-brained. And there would be things like flatness, abstracted products or features or ingredients or body parts, words getting in the way, voiceover or monologue, these are sort of me at you kind of communication, adjectives used as nouns, the left brain likes things, freeze frame effects, audio repetition, highly rhythmic soundtrack. These are the sorts of things that I would be looking for. And then the right brain features would be things like a clear sense of place, a scene unfolding with progression, characters with agency, implicit or unspoken communication, dialogue, distinctive accents, playing with words, subverting language, things set in the past, costumes or sets, reference to other cultural works, things like parody or pastiche, and then music with melody. And I reconstructed ad breaks from week 40 for a long-running soap opera in the UK called Coronation Street, going back 30 years. And we looked at over 600, maybe 700 ads for these features. And it was an assistant who did this, who I trained, and she had no knowledge of the year in which the ads were aired. So they were coded up blind. And then we worked the data at the end to see what it actually unscrambled it. What does it look like? And it revealed something fascinating. And that was that in 2006, we shifted massively away from whole or even slightly right-brained advertising towards a left-brain dominant advertising before the recession. And what we've lost, therefore, in this period are things like implicit communication, distinctive accents, a play on words, a scene unfolding with progression, music, cultural references, very worryingly. And also characters have disappeared in this period, almost entirely, repeatedly used characters. And in their place, we've got highly rhythmic soundtracks emerging, monologues, voiceover, words getting in the way, adjectives used as nouns, flatness, a lack of depth emerging. Is this just a quirk of Coronation Street advertising? I asked myself. Well, I looked at System 1's Test Your Ad database, and it's advertising database. We test every ad that airs on TV within 24 hours of it airing for emotional response. So I took a selection, 100 in the UK, 100 in the US, ads across the sectors at the bottom at random, and replicated the analysis and found it to be exactly the same today in the UK and in the US. I did it again on YouTube advertising in the same categories, same sectors, and found that actually it was even more dominant in online video than it is in TV advertising. Now this, if it were just an aesthetic change, who's to say what's right or wrong in matters of taste? Does it really matter? But it actually has a real bearing on how people connect with advertising. So we measure emotional response using a pictorial scale that people watch an ad and then select the face that best expresses how they feel. And it's based on the work of a psychologist called Paul Ekman. And we get a profile for every ad of how people feel about it. And working with effectiveness data from the IPA and elsewhere, we've created an approach, a model really, that helps you to model your share of market, the share of market changes by adjusting your share of voice with this star rating. So just to give you an example of how this works, Peter Field and Les Binet talk about the importance of extra share of voice, or share of voice relative to your share of market. And if you've got extra share of voice, you're likely to grow in the following period. 10 percentage points of extra share of voice gives you 0.5 percentage point of market share gain the following year. This chart on the left shows you how that plays out in UK cereals category. And it's that predicted growth that I just described there on the vertical axis against what actually happened in the following period along the bottom. And you can see there is this relationship between extra share of voice and share of market changes. But what if we could factor in emotional response to this, to every ad, for every brand and the spend associated with it? Well, by factoring quality of advertising as well as quantity, you get a much better explanation of market share changes over a longer time period. And so this ability to connect with people in your advertising is extremely important for share growth. So back to our story, and what we find is that the more left brain features you have in an ad, the less likely it is that you're going to connect with people, that you're going to generate an emotional response. This flatness and abstraction doesn't pay. Whereas this depth and humanity, the more right brain features you've got in an ad, the more likely it is that you're going to connect with people and generate an emotional response necessary for share growth. So if you take all of our features and line them up from most to sort of least effective, you find the right brain features at the top and the left brain features at the bottom. And if you overlay that chronological analysis, what we find is that the features that are most effective are becoming less common today, and the least effective left brain features are becoming more common today. This helps to explain the crisis in creativity that's been measured by the IPA over the last 15 years as well, same time period. Helps this sort of impetuous way of thinking, this left brain thinking, helps to explain the rise of short-termism that's happened over the same period, and also the decline in advertising effectiveness. Different data sets all pointing in the same direction. Bill Bernbach said, all of us who professionally use the mass media are the shapers of society. We can vulgarize that society, we can brutalize it, or we can help lift it onto a higher level. That's precisely what he and his agency did, of course. And if you'd like to know how this has happened and if there's anything we can do about it, then why not read this book? Because as Adrian Holmes, the creative director behind the Heineken ad I showed you, kindly writes on the front cover, if the advertising brain has stopped working properly, maybe this is the repair manual. Thank you. Any questions, Rob?
Fantastic. We do have a couple of questions, and I encourage anyone to post any more that they may have, but really, really good. It's a seminal piece of work and beautifully articulated, so really appreciate that. Before we have other questions coming through from our attendees, I just have one for you. Given the current crisis that we're in and the constraints in terms of abilities to create advertising, it might be quite hard for those on the call to develop anything other than sort of left brain creative, using stock images or perhaps text heavy. What would be your advice for our listeners?
Well, that's right. I mean, of course, that's the sort of the linear response is that, and to do that. But of course, that sort of work, as I show, won't connect very well. And in fact, in this period, what we're finding at System 1 in early work we've done is that it's the right brain sort of work that connects better, that has empathy and depth and humor even, than advertising that is more left-brained. So we've conducted a study where we've retested 100 ads from January and February of this year in this period in the UK and the US. And we found that overall, advertising is still connecting, on average as well as it ever has. We see this in our daily feeds of ads that we test. No real change. At the fringes, however, there are interesting things happening. What you find is that ads that have characters, so established characters, I call them fluent device characters, they're constantly used across a campaign, or scenarios like Snickers, you're not you when you're hungry, that are frequently used and established over time. These actually work, are continuing to work very well, holding up very well in this period. Also things set in the past, which enables you to do things that perhaps you can't show in a contemporary context. Anything with a sense of betweenness or connection, knowing glances, this sort of thing working well. because these people are crying out for it, because they're isolated and they're away from, you know, the real world. So anything that celebrates betweenness and connection, very important. And also advertising with a sense of place or community, this sort of local community way of looking at things that's referencing the world in our immediate sort of vicinity. And I by that I mean, you know, our countries as well, as much as, you know, locality is working a bit better. And then what's working slightly less well, with finding, is sort of the direct hard sell, at least at the moment, you know, sort of price promotion messages connecting less well than they did even back in January and February. Things focused on words, as you say, Rob, if it's just words or highly rhythmic work, not connecting as well. This is sort of very left brain stuff. And I think there's been this shift towards the right brain, you know, which is very alert and vigilant, alert to threats, interested in people, helping people, altruistic, and so on. Things that are around, ads around things, not connecting so well. Anything that's a bit aggressive or about control or power, also not connecting well. These are things of the left brain. And then, you know, anything about vanity or self-image, projecting vanity, you know, your sort of self-image to people, also just not quite as strong as it was. And that's because, you know, the right brain is all about a sort of sense of humility, and it's conscious of its time and place in the world, and it's aware of what's going on about it. And that's what brands need to be doing, having a sense of humility, a sense of humor, actually, a sense of spontaneity, altruism, generosity of spirit. These are things of the right brain, and very, very helpful guidelines for anyone creating work at the moment.
Lovely, thank you. And I think what you've just said answered, Thomas had answered a question about humour being on the right or left side, which you've just answered.
Yeah.
Right, thank you. And I'm going to take the liberty of merging two questions together. One person says, would you attribute the shift from right to left brain advertising? And merging with that, an interesting question when you think of who we are as an organisation. Do you feel that to what extent do you think globalization of communication has boosted this left brain advertising? So a hypothesis there from an anonymous question there. So yeah.
Well, I'm afraid I think it has had a bearing. It's one. There isn't one thing here that's done this. I mean, there are lots of things. I'll start, as it's in the question, with the global ad, because an ad that has to work everywhere is, of course, an ad that doesn't necessarily work anywhere very well, because it can't draw on local references, it can't draw on local culture, it can't show people talking very easily. You know, you're sort of reliant on words being flashed up on the screen. There's no, it's very difficult to show real places other than a very generic sort of cityscape. So all of these things have been ironed out, if you like, in the name of efficiency of advertising. But it's not just the global ad. You know, there are other things too that have happened in this period. Digitization, of course, is one of these things, and a fascination for the tools of the trade. You know, the pipe work over the work itself, and the way that we're all just connecting with each other has become a bit more narrow and goal orientated. You know, we've been on our phones, we've been texting, we've been using words, we've been devoid of social context, emails, and so on. You know, that things have changed in offices in this period, more open plan. I mean, the door has disappeared from the creative's room, so there's nowhere to be playful or silly anymore. Everything is overlooked by the rather paranoid left brain. You know, there are all sorts of things that have happened in this period. Processes have been introduced, cost efficiencies, also, you know, I have to say, you know, also procurement have broken down the creative task into little parts. That's what the left brain does, allocated resources against them. So all of these things go against the general way of working that's required for creatives to make work that really connects with people. And there are many other sort of things in the book that I talk about too.
Oh, that's terrific, and lots of really lovely compliments on your presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
But,
Thank you. Thank you.
But again, I'm going to merge a couple of questions here. Someone saying fantastic presentation, but with yourself, Peter and Les, saying these sorts of things, when do you think it's actually going to impact, when an advertiser is going to change?
Well, that's you know, that is one of one of the things about this terrible and awful virus is that I think people are going to feel things even more keenly. Actually, the sort of work that I talk about, the left brain work, which is quite, you know, sort of self-conscious, quite didactic, I think is just going to feel not quite right anymore. Certainly at the moment, for the next few months. And I do wonder, you know, as I mentioned earlier, in these periods of hardship, you know, the various plagues that happened before the Renaissance, you know, early Renaissance, but also in the 17th century, in the Baroque period, you know, there is a sort of general appreciation of what's important actually, and its people and its connection, and its, you know, a sort of a more holistic way of looking at the world, less narrow and goal orientated. And it may not last, it may not happen at all, but I can't help feeling that the situation we're in, you know, it may change things a little bit. But certainly, you know, the book is a starting point, and people have been reaching out from across the world, actually, in advertising agencies, broadcasters, but clients, of course, too, to say how you know, very very moved they are really by the book and what it means, and how it articulates something that they couldn't quite put their finger on, but have felt themselves in the last, you know, 15-20 years. Let's hope it's a start of something.
Terrific, thank you. I know we've gone a bit over time, but it's such a fascinating area, and we've had some terrific questions coming through. But I think Hannah's going to launch a quick feedback. But time for one last question. A few people have mentioned about channels that are available. So talking about, you know, digital transformation and the rise of mobile phone as a channel for communication, and how tough that basically makes it for brand owners to really deliver right brain advertising. Any thoughts on that? Obviously, digital has had an impact. But...
Yes, and you know, often the recommendations given by the big tech companies are directly for left brain work, splitting the screen up into different parts. You know, highly rhythmic work. You know, literally prescribing left brain work. And the work that I've done with other partners suggests that actually it's the living, it's characters, it's people, it's things that are slightly novel and out of the ordinary that attract and sustain the attention of the right brain. And if you want your advertising to be noticed and to be stuck with, you know, while people are, and people to actually watch it, and of course the longer they watch it, the more likely it is they'll remember the brand, and it becomes a valuable brand impression, the better. So this idea that, you know, we have to make everything shorter and quicker, it's just wrong, actually. What you really need to be doing is making people want to watch your advertising for longer and stick with it and enjoy it and remember it. And so, you know, advertising that appeals to the right brain, which is, as I said, responsible for 4 of the 5 types of attention, including alertness, vigilance, and sustained attention, is the kind of stuff that you need to be doing, things that are interesting to the right brain. So that's my answer.
But a challenge to that, if you like, and if about 3 people ask something similar along these lines, is that actually as attention spans decrease, do you not see that that's another challenge in relation to that?
Well, they're only decreasing. They're only decreasing because the work is no good.
Right.
You know, we need to fix the work, and then people will stick with it for longer. And that's the answer, in my view. And that actually, as I say in the book, we need to entertain for commercial gain. It's not enough to be relevant. It's not enough to be relevant. And there's this idea, particularly in social media today, that you know, it's sort of emerged over the last 15 years, of course, that this isn't a space for brands, and therefore we need to provide relevant content for people that fits in with their lives. And actually, that leads to the sort of left brain work that's very flat, that's often viewed from above on a countertop. It's often people making things from ingredients. You know, this is what the left brain loves, but is not going to attract and sustain attention for very long periods. And everything starts to look, of course, the same, as if it's been all through the same wind tunnel, you know, like cars. So yes, the extraordinary, the out of the ordinary, the living creatures, this is what's needed if you're going to attract and sustain attention and to build your brand in these online channels.
Terrific. Okay, well, we've used more time, more people's time than we originally thought, but that's thanks to this being really engaging. You know, thank you for your insight and for championing creativity. To be honest with you, really exciting area. So, on behalf of everyone who joined today, really appreciate that, Orlando. Thanks once again for joining.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.